1 book and video. The Apocalypse of God, Recovered, Quantum Physics in the book. In the last days, I have made some considerations about possible supernatant dimensions. As mentioned in the book The Apocalypse of God, there could be very many, probably infinite dimensions above us. One could imagine these dimensions in such a way that we exist in these indirectly, however, because of our own material corporeality, we cannot reach or cannot use them. As a comparison, imagine a two-dimensional figure that we see on a sheet of paper or on the screen of a television. It only fills length and width, and if it would live, it could therefore also only perceive length and width, can only move within it. It considers this world to be the only one or the only true one. If a three-dimensional object would suddenly dive through this two-dimensional world, the 2D figure would perceive that penetration as a flash in its part of the visible two-dimensional spectrum. So a three-dimensional ball that would dive through the picture or through a TV screen would perhaps be perceived in the two-dimensional world as a line that starts small, then gets bigger, then gets smaller again until it disappears altogether. The same thing can happen in front of and behind the two-dimensional person, because the ball can travel in front of and behind the two-dimensional image and repeat the same process somewhere else. If we now transfer this thought experiment to the 3- and 4-dimensional world, this means that we perceive similar effects in our world, but do not classify them as those. toHigher, as mentioned in my previous post, indirectly resorts to this assumption judge method. This is because the perception of a person's eyes in the two-dimensional world correspond to our conscious and subconscious minds, especially the subconscious mind in the 3- and 4-dimensional worlds, respectively, which toHigher has adopted in his Webot project. With the help of small programs, so-called spiders, he searches the internet for specific terms and word phrases entered by users. He collects these in order to create a future construct from them, assuming that when people write texts and articulate themselves, they often use terms that they have unconsciously absorbed and processed as key information from the future, that is, from a dimension above them. In this way, toHigher is able to filter out some words of a typical future event from the conversational and word salad of the internet, but only fragments. Now the question arises how one can bring a two-dimensional figure to perceive the third dimension respectively. How can the figure step over into this? It must train its eyes, which can perceive only length and height on the depth. Transferred to us four-dimensional people, this means, in order to become capable for the perception of the higher dimension, we do not have to train our eyes, but we have to make our brain, consciousness receptive for this perception. For this in particular, the ability of the uncoupling, solution of our consciousness from the materialistic and instinctive behavior and world models are necessary, which indeed enable our survival acting in this world. Instincts, feelings, innate behavioral patterns, see the Apocalypse of God, which at the same time deny us the ability to perceive other things to the same extent. It works similar to meditation, but shouldn't be confused with meditation. How can a person cross over or look into higher dimension? There are two possibilities. One is the purely spiritual one, to completely abandon animal instincts already done by the teachings of pure religions. It is the most difficult form. They reach only the most convinced people, the purest in heart. After death, their souls are trained so much that they survive a permanent existence in the higher dimensions. The second and simpler method is the one with which man will initiate the transformation of his existence in the future, via digital quantization of his consciousness towards the change of his mental state. He opens up overwhelming new powers of consciousness, existence and spirit, possibilities beyond our previous conceptions. Quanta are thereby the connectors of the dimensions and serve humans as basis for their transition. But attention, with this transition into higher dimensions, the change of the human existence must not mean a perfection in exchange of his being. Only detachment must be aimed at. The man must remain as man in his actual being, meaning that the digital quantization of the consciousness may serve only for the easier spiritual adjustment to higher dimensions. The development of the soul remains thereby furthermore the task of every human being, except that all of this will be applicable and understandable more easily in the future. So far, for now, access to quantum consciousness through meditation. As mentioned in the thread, the apocalypse of God, truth or later invention, everything that makes up the consciousness of an average human being in life is of biological origin, originates from survival instinctive basis, animal reaction patterns mixed with individual experiences and life imprints, the ego equals egoism, from which, for a human being, the most common form of generation of his consciousness arises. Instincts, feelings, emotions, imprints, experiences, convictions, etc. are on the one hand life sense donors, at the same time, however, always as blockers of other points of view, and or are the denier of another level of consciousness. For a different consciousness or for a new worldview, it is therefore important to understand, first of all, purely intellectually, on which basis the human being, oneself, always acts, thinks, and functions. For this it is of advantage if one has dealt with the following topics in advance. 1. Insight into the purely biological aspects of humans and the behavioral, thought, and social constructs that emerge from them. Hence the references in the thread to Desmond Morris's book and series The Human Animal on YouTube. In this series, anthropology and biology explain human thought, drives, and instincts in a completely unbiased way. A series that fundamentally shows how man physically ticks, in what way, so to speak, his mechanics works. Psychologists and sociologists usually look at man neglecting the basics of biology, a deficiency that gave rise to many ambiguous, often even wrong conclusions, which opened up room for all kinds of misinterpretations towards the human mind. The incorporation of human instinctual biology is an essentially important prerequisite, without which it is not possible to draw well-founded and objective conclusions about broader areas of human thought and behavior at all, especially the individual psyche, the individual ego, a deficiency which unfortunately continues until today. 2. Psychological and depth psychological observation. It does not necessarily require extensive study of depth psychology in order to understand the sometimes purely character-based and innate behaviors or idiosyncrasies of a person. However, to have dealt more extensively with psychology in general, as well as with one's own individual psyche, is essentially advantageous, since one learns to understand the reaction patterns of one's own ego better, and thus raises the step to the third and most important point on a good foundation. 3. This last and most extensive step is the spiritual level, where the human being, with the knowledge of his innate thinking and behavior, as well as the insight into his individual personal acting, must learn to detach himself for a short time from his biological drives, character imprints, and value schemes with his mind alone. Meditation is the tool that prepares this process, but does not produce it holistically. Meditation only introduces a changed view of everyday consciousness and its reality. The finer perception occurs only after a certain state of consciousness has been reached, has set in with meditation and prayer. If the consciousness opens, changes, permanently in everyday life as well, the meditation has reached its goal, to give new impulses to the own consciousness, together with its surrounding reality. The goal of meditation is here not to create a better coping in the everyday world, which is why many people practice meditation only for this reason, but lies primarily in gaining an objectifying view of reality. But even meditation and prayer are only one method to generate this, respectively to finally get in touch with the quantum world. In order to be able to detach oneself from one's biological, psychological drives, views, and aspirations, to be able to objectify oneself and others, above all, the active trying out of new behaviors must be learned. The variation and change of well-rehearsed individual everyday behaviors, to make different decisions, to change and transform destructive, self-absorbed, egomaniacal behaviors, e.g., to stand up emotionally for someone whom one would otherwise never have stood by, would even have detested on the basis of one's own scale of values. This sharpens the will for a reverse reaction. It trains to expose oneself to one's fears, to overcome them as well as to qualify evaluations of good and evil. The more often one exercises such changes, the more something changes in oneself, However, this is not an activation of interpersonal social behavior, but an opening of one's own consciousness in order to understand its role and effect and to survey it anew. You can start this with small steps, but they must always be expanded, so you must not become lazy or anxious again during this process. You have to keep expanding the goals you set for yourself and also keep reminding yourself and have the courage to take the next step, a constant process of introspection. Some people who have reached a certain stage of development by these methods will suddenly perceive a sound during their meditation, during the conscious emptying, a kind of deep humming which some only realize when they are already slipping back into everyday thinking from the meditation. Some also slide back out of shock or astonishment during their first attempts. Others again perceive the emptiness like a state of deep sleep or realize some kind of picture, form, or feel, recognize an illogical pattern, e.g. two lines that are at the same time three lines, although they can only be two. After long practice, some may experience the imposition of emotions, that emotions and situations unpleasantly impose to them, seemingly lacking any relation. After some time, these feelings may even become familiar to them, however, in fact, they do not relate to them. Also, the mentioned humming must not be confused with something that would come from oneself. Also, it is not a sound in the conventional sense. It seems as if one feels this sound in oneself. Others again perceive the sound directly in the head when they hear it. Some people, by this form of meditation, detach themselves more and more from the so-called reality in their everyday consciousness, can feel their surrounding world differently, which means they realize how absurd the rules of the modern world, the values, the meanings are, reveal them as unimportant, strange, or pathological in their views and constructs. As mentioned, this state arises only when one has already discarded, can discard certain instinctive biological as well as egomaniacal value schemes, has completely adjusted to the actual insignificance of the material world. When one is finally ready, one does not even need meditation anymore to be able to see and understand. Praying for God's plan, following these rather rambling approaches to prayer and the connection to God or the quanta dimensions and angels, I would like to add a few more philosophical considerations to prayer for everyone who would like to try prayer once longer and or permanently. Prayer is the encounter with God, as Laurent already described. In prayer itself, a connection is established. God cannot get in contact with you if you ignore him, do not recognize him, do not want to notice his appearance. From the psychological point of view, it could now be argued that one would suggest something to oneself during prayer and in the time afterwards, henceforth reacting to signs which we become able to see and interpret because we want to. The classical psychology holds the word paranoia or schizophrenia ready for it. But in the quantum world, everything has a meaning, depending on how the receiver is adjusted, reacts individually to it, or is made receptive for it, wants to make himself. Constantly information is sent from the quantum world, which we explain to ourselves in the frame of causal, mental science. However, this is a four-dimensional thinking error. People react indeed always accordingly to information which fits into their thinking or delusion pattern. They seem to suck up some signs downright with their interpretation into their thinking. See Bach play in The Apocalypse of God. But at the same time, there is a solution within this to be discovered, an info, similar to the example shown by me about a figure in the 2D world which sees a flashing, but would classify this phenomena within their momentary objective worldview. In our four-dimensional world, however, this flashing shows itself to us more diffusely, because the ability to perceive the superordinate dimension depends on our consciousness, subconsciousness. It is therefore rather typical and inevitable for us to classify these signs as imagination or nonsense, basically meaning that everything what one perceives after the activation of his consciousness has a meaning, depending on how much one believes and is decided, how intensive the connection to God has been established. For us humans, consciousness matters in any area. But to describe it a bit more vividly, the prayer can also be understood as an activation of contents, in the form of other persons, events, states, etc., or as the activation of the own conscious self in the future. You direct yourself with the prayer to where you should go. Since events, states, and your future self are not yet solidified, You can solidify with the prayer, with your faith and your resolution, your future self to that self, which exists at the moment only as vibration, as possibility in the quantum world. This gradual solidification of your ego in the future sends you information through the ghost effect, ghostly long-distance effect, as Einstein called it, directly back into your consciousness, which in turn again consolidates your future self and leads to the future self, with whom you have connected in your prayer. As I said, however, only if you maintain the connection, your prayer, i.e., including faith and resolution. By the way, the reason why some prayers don't work is because they are self-centered, they are ultimately aimed at their own benefit. On the general development of mankind, these prayers are not good, because you can only join the development wanted by God. That is, only if you work for God's plan, your prayer works, even if you think that this benefit is only of little importance. Changing the world completely against the prepared way does not work. If you want to participate, God will include you in His plan. Nevertheless, however, if you do not want to participate, it is always worthwhile, at least for everyone, to pray for his salvation, beyond material states and causalities of ego consciousness. Is there a way to transcend the materialistic causal states of existence, to understand them, dive into them, and to dissolve within them, with the mind alone, with the soul? What does soul actually mean? What is consciousness? Is the soul immortal? Are soul and consciousness the same? Or is there a difference? Basically, they are equal. But in terms of perishability, materialistically produced consciousness, and possibilities, potential ground states, these terms always oppose each other ambivalently. The individual ground states always consist of chosen materialistic, biological functioning, regulating loops from matter and ego on the one hand, and hyperdimensional quantum technical consciousness effects on the other hand, free will, decision and attitude, oscillation/observing behavior, belief and attitude. So is it primarily about one's own choice? Is it about deciding against the materialistic and biological regulation loops? Do you reach a pure consciousness this way, a pure soul consciousness? People who learn to decide against the own causal and determining working psyche, to this end you have to recognize such patterns first, break physical laws on the consciousness level. Is it possible by internalizing this knowledge to break materialistic causalities and regulation loops as well? Would it be possible to change the materialistic dependencies, internal just as external ones? Well, if the one thing is possible, definitely the other one is too. This therefore requires a precise participation and another factor, the quantum mechanical oscillation. Matter and all knotted regulation loops are quantum mechanical oscillations. In a deeper sense, this also means the belief of a person. Oscillation is a possibility, meaning oscillation, matter is in any case nothing real yet, lacking an observer. An exaggerated, formulated, reversed conclusion is that nothing really exists. Everything, any physical form, even you, your body, your mind, are nothing more than oscillations, mainly emerged from ego consciousness. Your handcuffed soul consciousness is less an oscillation though, simply spoken, rather it is part of a consciousness expansion which itself is fed by this expansion. Your ego, as well as a smaller part of the vibration of your pure consciousness, always gets into interaction with the dead, inanimate, unconscious matter. This means you, as consciousness, give existence to the material things at all, in the broadest sense also life. That means develop your free will and your belief, the behavior of matter when observed. You can have a stronger or different effect on the surrounding vibrations and interact with them. Your pure consciousness can do more than ego consciousness. So, think about how you can use a combination between quantum mechanical consciousness effects can let arise highly complex interacting application forms, from decision, free will, pure heart, true love and the observation, faith attitude. Look for the points of intersection, for the orientation for the application and combination of quantum mechanical consciousness effects, see contribution. Interactions between quantum world and our consciousness, part 1 and 2, in this blog. To regulate one's state of mind in such a way that one can experience and do things that border on magic is merely detachment. And every person will be able to do this one day. It is the way to something new. Similarly, as if one can let float an object alone with strength of the thoughts, in what or where, then also in the future the next step is to be looked for and to be done. If one has understood and realized mentally that the material world does not really exist, that it is only an image of and in everyone himself, just as anyone can detach himself from the limited functions of his mind, as a consequence one will also be able to detach himself from his physical body or redefine its functions. But this requires courage for the change, for the science, and a lot of strength for each individual. So, time to grow up, because the only meaning of life is the discovery, realization, and understanding of consciousness, pure consciousness, by free will and faith, the development and liberation of the soul to return to the hyperdimensional field. P.S. Amusing action in October. Those who it concerns know what is meant.